Well, a couple of weeks ago, we spent some time thinking about the big picture. I had behind me the big picture of the Bible, a big timeline. And last week we began the book of Ruth, just looking at chapter 1, and it really meeting the characters of the book of Ruth. In chapters 2 to 4 that we're going to look at today, we meet another character. In chapter 2, verse 1, let me read to you. Chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. We're going to look at the whole of chapters 2 to 4 today. It's a great story. So I'm not going to read it before I preach on it. I'm going to read it as we go through it. So let me pray, and then we will get into the story. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you speak to us through your word. Father, I pray that as we listen to this story, as we read about what you're doing in the world, that you would open our eyes to what you're doing in our world and see that you have been acting throughout history to the present day and will continue to the future. Father, enable us to know how to live in your world. Amen. So last week you met Naomi and Ruth, who after facing great difficulty decided to move back from Moab. Ruth and Naomi, or Naomi and Ruth, her daughter-in-law, Ruth said she's coming with her. They returned, and Naomi assessed her status when she came into town and met the crowd. She said, "The Lord has testified against me. I went away full and have come back empty." The second assessment of went away full and came back empty seems a bit harsh to Ruth, who comes with her. But Ruth is a Moabitess. The Moabites are enemies. The people who gathered to come and meet Naomi when she came back would have probably thought she was even less than empty if she'd said, "But I've brought back this Moabite woman with me who's my daughter-in-law of the son who died." But what we will see in these chapters 2 to 4 is that Naomi is very definitely not empty with Ruth. While God may have testified against her, she is very definitely still in God's care and God's plans. Chapter 2 teaches us about Ruth, teaches her she is a willing servant of her mother-in-law. Chapter 2, verse 2 says, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favour." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And off she went. And she does the work. She works in the field. Let me read it for you. Verse 4. And behold, so she set out and went and gleaned in the field. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." Well, we'll get to that. Verse 6, bit more about Naomi. The servant who was in charge of the reapers, talking to Boaz, said, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." And at the end of the chapter, we see a bit more about Ruth. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went to the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. Ruth shows herself to be a godly woman, a woman who cares for her mother-in-law, who provides for her mother-in-law, who is willing to do. She's not just sitting back and waiting for Naomi to look after her and looking for Naomi to do. She goes. She jumps on the front foot and gets out there to find food. It would have been known that one of the rules for Israel was that when they're gathering their crops, they are to leave some behind for the alien, the stranger, the person who isn't an Israelite. Ruth is that person. It's there. But what's interesting is that Ruth goes and asks. Ruth is polite. Ruth does the right thing and looks for the opportunity to be cared for and to say, is it okay that I do this? So she does the right thing. The new character that we met in verse 1, though with no context except that when the writer wanted us to understand that Boaz is a key figure in this story. And in a time when God's people were rarely godly, Boaz is a standout. In verse 4, I read it before, but I'll read it again. Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" Boaz shows himself to be a worthy man in the way that he speaks. When he welcomes his workers, he welcomes them, "The Lord be with you." And "The Lord bless you," they come back with. He is a godly man. God is at the heart of what he is doing. God is at the heart of who he is. As opposed to the rest of Israel, who did whatever they wanted, Boaz appears as someone who does what God wants. He treats his workers well, and he treats Ruth well. Listen to verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favour in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Boaz treats her well. Why have I found favour in your eyes? Why have you taken notice of me, since I am a foreigner? Boaz answers her, verse 11, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. And how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." There are many who say that Boaz is a bit keen on Ruth at this point. She's attractive to him. It's interesting that there actually is no reference to Ruth's outward appearance in the book of Ruth. But there is plenty to say about her character. And I think what Boaz hears, Boaz is attracted to. Her character is attractive to him. There must have been some reason that he said, "Whose young woman is this?" But what he hears, he responds to. And he responds to in a caring way. In a way that says, you are under God's care. The phrase that Boaz uses in verse 12, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, tells me that Boaz regards Ruth as an Israelite, as a member of God's family, as someone who is under God's care in a very literal way. And I think he responds and says that you are under my care. And he does that. In verse 14 it says, "At mealtime, Boaz said to her, 'Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine.' So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, 'Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her.'" Boaz cares for Ruth. He provides for her. He is looking out for her. I think Boaz and Ruth both are described here as being people who are behaving in a godly manner, in a righteous manner. There's no broad plan. They're just doing the right thing under God. John Piper, an American theologian, describes their behaviour as strategic righteousness. They're doing a good thing, a right thing, but it's a thing that will also, they're doing things that will benefit them, benefit each other. When Ruth returns home, Naomi is very pleased to her. We hear her say from verse 19, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Gillian pointed out that it's interesting that you have been cared for, that you have things to provide. A man must have cared for you. But that is the society that they live in. And it demonstrates again and again the powerlessness of women in this situation. It's just assumed that for them to go forward, go ahead, they need a man to care for them. We go on. She told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." That Boaz, that Ruth found herself in Boaz's field, brings to light, I think, the other key player in the book of Ruth. We see it in this chapter and we'll see it in other ones. And that key player, of course, is coincidence. Luck. Isn't it lucky that Ruth found herself gathering grain in the farm of a good man, a godly man, a near relative, as Naomi says? There were obviously potentially devastating consequences of finding yourself in the wrong field. Boaz says, "I've instructed the young men not to touch you." That's somewhat assumed as a possibility. Now, of course, I don't think it's coincidence. I don't think it's luck. I don't think it's chance. I think it's God. I think it's God who is working in this. I think it's God who is working here. God is working with a broader plan. God is working to put Ruth in the right place at the right time. God is working to give Boaz the opportunity to see Ruth, to recognise Ruth, to ask about Ruth, to get to know Ruth, to provide for Ruth. Naomi, though, there is some strategy from Ruth and Boaz, but Naomi, I think, is the key strategist in this situation, other than God. In chapter 3, we read, "Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, 'My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?'" And it's important, I think, to recognise the importance of that word rest in the Old Testament. Rest is what God did on the seventh day. Rest is what God's people, the Israelites, were seeking when they were in the desert for 40 years. They were seeking their rest. They were seeking the promised land. They were seeking their rest. And Naomi says, "Isn't it right that I seek rest for you?" She's not rested now. She is the worker in the family. She is the one for whom life is hard. She is living in Israel as an alien, or working as an alien in Israel. And yet, rest would require a husband. Rest would require care. And so the rest is for Ruth, but it's also for Naomi. If Ruth finds rest, then Naomi has the potential to find rest. And so she says in verse 2, "Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say I will do." Now, to me, this seems like a dangerous plan. Sending a young woman. We assume Ruth is young. We don't know how long she was married to Mahlon. We don't, in that 10-year period that they were in Moab, that Naomi was in Moab. But we assume that she's somewhere between 17 and 25, 26. She's a young woman. Sending her to the threshing floor to wait until a man has had his drink and goes to bed, to lie down where he lies, to uncover his feet, to wake him up presumably, puts her in danger. But I think Naomi has listened. And I think Naomi is assuming Boaz's godliness. Naomi is assuming Boaz's righteousness and that he will do the right thing. She trusts him. Whether that's founded or not, we will see. Well, let's see. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman." He's woken up. There's a young woman at his feet, and she says, she says, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Using the same words that Boaz had used previously to describe how she was under God's care, she says, "Let me come under your care." It's assumed that this is an offer of marriage, an asking for marriage, or that Ruth is asking Boaz to marry, that she marry him. We're assuming that Boaz is an older man. We're assuming that Boaz isn't married, though there's nothing to say that he doesn't have other wives, except that he's on the threshing floor at night and sleeping there. He is a close relative. He is a kinsman redeemer. He is someone who could do that. He is obviously interested. He wakes up. He doesn't go, "We'll deal with this tomorrow." He's awake. He wants to have the conversation. He says, "May you be blessed. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, that you have not gone after young men." He's obviously older. He presumably is rich, but he says, you've not gone after younger men, whether poor or rich. Don't be afraid. I'll do for you all that you ask. And it's true, verse 12, that I am a redeemer, yet, dun dun dun, just for a bit of drama, he says, there is a redeemer nearer than I. Oh no! The love story, could it not happen? He says, remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good. Let him do it. We don't want him to do it. We want Boaz to do it. We want Ruth and Boaz, this beautiful love story, to be finished. We don't want her to marry someone else. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I'll redeem you. Lie down until the morning. And it's all appropriate. And it's all good. Ruth does what Boaz tells her. He sends her home in the morning with extra barley. She doesn't go home empty-handed. The words that Ruth uses to spread her wings over, well, that's classic. A marriage proposal, an invitation to marriage. He's obviously keen. She is worth staying up for. She's worth being awake for. As so many couples have grabbed those last minutes on the under the porch light before one has to go home during courtship. Boaz and Ruth are courting. They're interested. They're keen. And Naomi knows it. When Ruth goes home and tells the story, she says to her, well, just wait and see. He'll deal with this thing first thing. And he does. Chapter 4. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I'd tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Oh no. No. We don't want that to happen, do we? This is a love story. But of course, in every good love story, there's always a problem. Boaz is going to deal with it. So Boaz says, verse 5, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." If you're going to have the land, if you're going to grow your property portfolio, you need to know you're going to acquire another wife or a wife. And the fellow says, "I can't redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Boaz is doing absolutely the right thing. Boaz says, "I'm not first, I'm second, I'll go to the first. If he wants to do it, then fine." He follows the rules. This isn't a situation where, well, love is all that matters, so we'll focus on that. No. He does the right thing. But he does make sure that the other man knows, well, it's not just the land, it's not just about your balance sheet looking better. There's a possibility that some damage could be done to your inheritance here of your current children. He's not that interested, so Boaz swoops. Verse 7. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers, and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses to this. You are witnesses this day." Boaz follows the rules. Boaz does what is right. Boaz does what is required. He does what is necessary. He follows the letter of the law to get it right. It's a bit weird that Ruth isn't here. But anyway, love wins out. The elders make a statement that sounds like a prayer. Verse 11, "Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, 'We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman.'" May she produce many children for you. May this be a marriage that is good for Israel, that is good for you, that is good for God. Verse 13, "So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son." What a fun and good story. What a nice story of love. Of people doing the right thing by God. But there's a bigger story going on here. Behind it all, in the history of Israel, there is a bigger story going on. And at this point in the story, the focus of the story shifts away from Ruth and Boaz and shifts back onto Naomi. Verse 14, "Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighbourhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. We see that broader picture. We see that bigger idea, the bigger concept of what God is doing in the world. And Naomi, the big arc, or actually it's a downward arc, isn't it? Because things were bad at the start of the story when she and Elimelech moved to Moab. And it's gone down, 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 and slowly it's come back up. Through the actions of Ruth, the actions of Boaz, through the action of God, through her strategic movement, through her recognition of a good man in Boaz and what to do, how to make it happen. Why did she send Ruth in the middle of the night? I'm not sure. Except it probably wouldn't have been appropriate for Ruth to ball up to Boaz in the middle of the day and suggest marriage. But it is this point of the story where there's another telling of David's genealogy. Boaz gets a Guernsey in this one, verse 18. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. What a great story. What a great story. It's interesting when you look at genealogies is that what we see at this point in the genealogy is this insertion of Ruth. After the insertion of Boaz's mother, who was Rahab the prostitute, who rescued the spies of Israel from the town of Jericho. She also was someone who was inserted from outside of Israel into being a key player in the story of Israel, the story of God. In the book of Matthew, where we have a genealogy. It's funny, the words in the genealogy are hard, and I struggle with the word genealogy. But the genealogy of Jesus, you see Ruth and Rahab inserted. I think just so that God can say, "You're not in charge of this, Israel. I'm in charge of this." And I can bring in other people from other places. I can add other people. The rescue of God's people is always about God. God can use who he wants. He's not restricted by any rules that he creates for his people. The rules he creates for his people are so that his people can live under him. The rules are not created to restrict God. They're not to make him live right with them. They're to make them live right with him. Ruth, Boaz and Naomi, I think, each engage in some strategic righteousness in this story. They do the right thing, but they do things that will enable them to live better. But in this story, God is the star. It's a story about God and what he is doing in the world. It's a story about his ability to make unlikely things turn out for not just good outcomes, but extraordinary outcomes. So what do we do with this? I know it's a long talk, but what do we do with this? Friends, be righteous. Live rightly. Live to please God. Live right with God. To live right with God, to do right by God, you need to know God. Which is why doing Bible studies are so valuable and so important. The way we're doing Bible study at the moment, we're doing it with the books that I'm preaching on, I think are so valuable, because if the only information you're getting from the Bible is from my talks, as much as I value preaching and love preaching and enjoy preaching, it's not enough. These Bible studies give you the opportunity to hear from God each day, to allow God to speak to you each day. Hearing God speak enables you to know how to live as God's person. It's important to remember the situation that Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi found themselves in the time of the Judges. The end of the book of Judges ends with this verse, 21-25. In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. It sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? Everybody does what is right in their own eyes. That's what people do around us. Friends, that is not the way to live a godly life. To do what's right in my own eyes, our own eyes, your own eyes. To live a godly life, to live a righteous life, is to know God and to know what He wants from you. He is the arbiter of right and wrong, not me. So look to God. Listen to God. Follow Jesus and glorify Him. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this great story. We thank you that you have acted in history, past, present, and will in the future. Father, enable us to live lives that bring glory to you as we live righteously. Give us wisdom to know how to live strategically, righteously, for your glory. Amen.